Welcome to a Google Developers Live session on the Santa Tracker for Android app.
My name is Jan Felix Schmarkert and I'm a developer programs engineer on the Android team. I'm based here in Sydney and I worked on the Santa Tracker Android app.
Hi, I'm Anka Cotwell and I'm a developer advocate on the Android team. I'm also based out of Sydney, Australia, and was also an engineer on the Santa Tracker Android app. So what's Santa Tracker Android?
That's a really good question. So Santa Tracker in general, the idea was that you can follow Santa on Christmas Eve and you can see where Santa is. And because we're both on the Android team, we thought it would be really nice if you had something native on your phone. And that's where the Santa Tracker Android application came in.
Yeah, so I mean, from our point of view, the vision was that we would focus on an amazing map experience where you could follow Santa on Christmas Eve as he traveled the world and delivered presents. Let's talk a little bit about the technology then. What is it that we used to put Santa Tracker together this year?
I mean, as you've seen, we've released the Google Maps API version 2 for Android. And that allowed us to put together a fantastic map experience with 3D buildings, and you can tilt the camera, zoom the camera, so all sorts of really cool stuff.
Yeah, and the great thing is that we were able to build an experience that's interactive but also passive, and that's what we're going to talk about in this session, how we built it and what was our vision behind it. So we've already said that the experience is going to be Santa moving from location to location on a map. So pop quiz, with this new library, what do we use to drop our map in onto the screen?
So we're using a map fragment, and that's just like any other fragment you've used on Android before, but it's a Google map.
Neat. So if people have been asking for a map fragment for a while, we can now have multiple map fragments if you want, but we're only obviously using the one, right?
Yeah, just one, yeah.
Okay, so now we have a map, and we want to drop Santa in on the screen. How do we drop Santa in? How do we display Santa on that map?
So Santa is actually just another marker on the map. So we have a special icon. So when you create a marker, you can set a title, you can set a location, and you can also set an icon. So in this case, we have a little special icon we're using for Santa. And that's where you can see where Santa is at the moment. Okay,
so Santa's there, we have the map. You said we can set a location. Santa's going to move, so how do we do the animation then?
Yeah, that's a good question. So basically we are changing the position of the marker along the way. So we have a thread running and we're basically saying, okay, move the marker, update the location of that particular marker.
Interesting. So how do we know where Santa is at any point in time? Because I mean, obviously we're communicating with Santa as he travels on Christmas Eve so that he tells us that, hey, I've reached this location on my way here. How is that all working?
So the back end is, so basically the back end is based, so we have an API, a Santa API as we've called it internally, because we have a few different clients actually talking to Santa. So instead of Santa having to talk to every single person around the world, Santa's just talking to our engineers, and then all the clients can access this particular API. And the API was actually built in App Engine using Go, and the Android app is accessing it. We have a Chrome extension and we have a website as well, and they're all accessing the same API that we're using to find out where Santa is and where he's heading next.
So that App Engine API basically notifies all of the clients that here is Santa's latest up-to-date location on the night.
That's right.
Okay, great. So as Santa travels from place to place, location to location, I guess, how do we tick off a location as having been visited? What are we doing on the Android app to show that?
We have markers that show where Santa has already been on the map. So every location Santa has visited, which we know from the timestamp and from what Santa's told us, you basically put a marker there and say, look, Santa's already been there. And then you can go off and you can click on and it shows you how many presents Santa has delivered there. So we actually add a marker for each place Santa has visited along the way.
Okay, great. Is there any tricks that you had to go across? I mean, you're telling me if you're adding markers, we're going to have lots and lots of markers on this map. And if we're zoomed out, are there performance considerations?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, Santa is visiting a lot of places around the world. And the map view actually is very performant, even when we have a couple of markers on the map at the same time. That's actually really fantastic to see, even on low-end devices. One issue though is if you have a lot of markers and you've zoomed out, for example, they tend to overlap a bit. So there were a few tricks we had to use to make sure that our center marker, which is just another marker, always stays on top. So when you tilt the camera, for example, that's where the Z-index issue comes in. So which marker is on top?
Which marker is in front is what you mean,
exactly.
Right? Because obviously I can imagine on a map, if I'm looking at a map in a certain way and I've got a bunch of markers, the ones that are closest to me should be the ones in front.
Exactly right, yeah.
And that would make sense for the location markers, but when it comes to Santa, we kind of want to show Santa on top or in front of all of the markers. So I can see that that's interesting. Looks like we're using the library in ways that they hadn't really designed for.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, yeah.
So you mentioned also before that we had a thread running that updated Santa's location. We also seem to be talking to an API. So there's obviously some background work, some user interface work. How did you pull all of that stuff together?
So the one issue here is that you can only interact with the map on the UI thread. So we had to make use of different threads. You should never access an API or a web service on the UI thread, for example.
I think what you mean is you shouldn't do any networking on the foreground of the UI thread.
Exactly. And the same goes for calculations, because we're dealing a lot with latitudes and longitudes and a lot of other calculations. So we didn't want to do any of that in the UI thread. So, but the issue was you can only access the map on the UI thread. So there are a few things we had to think about. We had to be very careful on how you design your application, how you interact with it.
Right. So we obviously did some pretty hardcore thread synchronization there to make sure that everything runs smooth and will run smooth on the.
Having said that, handlers are fantastic for this. We actually worked quite well. Okay. Very easy to use. Yeah.
There you go. Good tip there. Now the other thing I guess I want to ask you is in terms of the Android lifecycle, because if you think about Android, we have on create, on start, on resume, on pause. We have a couple of hundred markers or thousands of markers. Do we need to do anything special? Because Santa's moving all the time as well.
Yeah, the thing is Santa doesn't stop. So when you pause the application, you go back into it. The question was, how do we restore the correct state? So how do we tick off the right places Santa has been to? And in our case, we found it was the easiest if we just reset the map completely and add everything back in. So we know exactly where Santa is up to. We can put Santa in exactly the right spot. And performance-wise, it wasn't actually an issue at all. If you make sure you calculate as much as you can beforehand, you're storing all the data in the correct format. So we're using a SQLite database in the background. It actually works really well.
Okay. So at this stage, Santa's animating on the map, but it's really hard to tell, where he's been and where he's going. So what solutions did we have for that? Yeah,
so we noticed that as we were experimenting and using the app, so we decided to make it really obvious that Santa is moving across the map by showing his progress. So basically we've added a line from where he's left to the last place where he's been and where he's currently on the map. So you can zoom out and you can quite clearly see where Santa is at the moment.
And so from a developer standpoint, how do we draw the line?
Yeah, quite literally, we're using a polyline to do that. So we have 2 points as part of the polyline. So where he has been, so his departure place, his departure location, and his current location. And we simply have a thread where we update one of the points, and that's basically how we move the line together with Santa.
Awesome. So polylines are obviously a feature of the Map View API,
yeah, that's right.
version 2. And then what about the destination itself? Because you could think that the source is a marker, the destination is a marker.
So basically we added just another marker that's a bit transparent. It's basically just to show that this is where Santa is going to be. That's where he's heading.
Got you. So now we had a map. We had Santa moving on that map, location to location. The location markers would show up. But really, one of the things that we wanted to do was make sure that users didn't have to play with the app, didn't have to pan the app around to follow Santa. So what do we do from a passive experience point of view to make that fun?
So we took advantage of the camera animations. So you can control the camera in a map view. And that's what we're using here. So basically, as Santa is moving around the map, we're animating the camera as well. So we're zooming in and making sure that Santa is always on the screen. So now we can really see that the application is coming together with a map. We have Santa. Santa is moving on a map. But I think there's still something missing that really makes this a global experience that everyone around the world can enjoy the app.
That's right. Localization. We wanted to make sure that this app was something that people all over the world could experience, and people all over the world speak different languages. So we've actually spent quite a lot of time localizing this app in as many languages as possible, and I've covered just about every language that Android supports. So all of the strings are localized. But the thing to keep in mind when you do localization is not just that the strings change. You have to worry about the context, that things make sense. And also, from a developer's point of view, you actually have to look at things like your layouts, how big all your different fields are, because some languages actually take up more characters to display the same level of text than others. So in some ways, English is a bit of a medium in terms of size. Some of the Asian languages use finer characters that take up less space, but then languages like German actually have an English character set, but they actually have quite a lot of characters for each of the words. So with all of these pieces coming together in our development lifecycle, this was really the right time to send out a version of the app for internal testing to Googlers all around the world to get their feedback. So we did that. Did you find any overwhelming feedback that people were really feeling strongly about?
Yeah, so we built this passive experience where we always followed Santa, but we found people wanted to go back to see where Santa has already been or where he might head next. They wanted to go around and explore the map themselves. So that was something we had to consider and we had to add. And
so up until now, what we'd done was focus on the passive experience where the camera would automatically follow Santa, but now people wanted to be able to move stuff around. So that was a really a strong piece of feedback. But one of the sort of the initial visions for the Android app was that we didn't want there to be any user interface on the app itself. We didn't want there to be buttons and things for people to toggle, because at the end of the day, on a phone you've got such small amounts of real estate, and obviously on a tablet you have more. But remember, one of the user experience guidelines for Android is that regardless of whether you're on a phone or a tablet, you should be able to have the same functionality, right? So the layout, even though layouts can change, all the functionality should be there. So given that we had this vision that we didn't want to be able to want too much user interface, but users wanted to be able to toggle between an automatic and a manual mode, what do we do?
Yeah, so that was a really interesting question. So so rather just simply adding a button, we made this a bit more interactive. So basically, as soon as you touched the map, we came out of Santa Car mode. That's what we called it, Santa Car mode, because you're following Santa. So as soon as you touched the map, a little button popped up, and you could basically say, oh, hang on, if I want to follow Santa again, I can tap on that button. But we also added a timeout to it, because the passive experience was really what we were going for and what the focus of the app was. So after 20 seconds, 25 seconds of inactivity on the map, we actually popped the countdown up, and you had 5 seconds before we enabled Santa Cam again, we followed Santa again.
Cool. I mean, that to me was like a really fun bit. And the other point we should mention that although we called it the Santa Cam button or the toggle, it was a styled button. It's not. We didn't just have a normal rectangular button. We tried to make it a bit more fit within the theme of Santa.
Yeah.
So what did it look like?
So it didn't actually look like any normal standard button you've seen before. It was round. There was a big icon of Santa icon was on there. So you obviously it wasn't active, so you can touch and you got the feedback. But it didn't look like a normal button. But we actually spent a fair bit of time making sure people knew that they could interact with it.
Yes, including the touch feedback. That's
right, touch feedback.
That's very important. When you're building custom user interfaces, touch feedback is very important, because otherwise it doesn't look like people can interact with it. Okay, so now we had this Santa Cam toggle. You could go in and out of it. But how would people know whether they were in Santa Cam or not in Santa Cam?
Yeah, so we wanted to add something to make it obvious that you're following Santa, or you can interact with the map. So we actually added a border around the map, and all we did was basically we added a graphic on top of the map when Santa Cam mode was active. And the trick we used here was so we wanted something that looked a bit like you were dreaming, or you were looking through a telescope or something, a bit magical, fun. So we basically got a low-res PNG, semi-transparent with a kind of transparent board on the outside, and we simply scaled it up, and that looked really well. So we had nice alpha values around it, and it actually took a fair bit of time to get the color right and to get the alpha value right and all these things. It's quite tricky.
I think we should mention the story of the color in terms of getting that right. We started off with a fairly dark color. I think it was black or gray, But the feedback that we got was that this might scare children.
Yeah.
And so we actually changed the color from a dark color to a yellowy color. So it was completely see-through in the middle, and around the edges you'd get a nice sort of almost a glow type effect.
That's right.
So there was one last thing that I believe we did after that first internal test, and that was to make the experience feel even more immersive.
Yeah, so the app, so we basically added low profile mode. So instead of completely going to full screen and taking over the entire device, we basically enabled low profile mode, which dims the taskbar and the buttons. And the idea was we were kind of trying to draw people into the app while not completely taking everything over.
Yeah, that was that feedback was really, really important, and it's something that we highly recommend whenever you're building any software. Distribute the app to as many people as you can to get diverse feedback through it, because it changed a lot of our design.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about the village. The village was really intended to be a landing page for users of the app, somewhere where it's the initial screen that you see, and it's where users would be until Santa took off. So obviously we had a countdown to Christmas till Santa took off. The vision behind the Android app was really to build an awesome map experience as we track Santa around the world. So the village was really intended to be just somewhere where users could see the countdown and didn't have the interactive elements that the web version had.
Okay, it still looks pretty good. Let's have a look and talk about some of the implementation tricks that you had to go through. So let's talk about this image. It looks like a huge image you're using there.
Yeah, so the village itself was actually 10,000 pixels wide. And what we did is we split it up into 5 slices, because on Android you can only have an image can only be a maximum of 2048 pixels, either wide or high. That's the maximum you can have. So what we did is we split our 10,000 pixel wide image into 2048 pixel slices, and then showed it on screen.
Okay. So as we're watching this here, you can see there's some scrolling happening. So let's talk about that. So how are you doing that?
Yeah, so I mean, we're just offsetting the images left and right, but one of the things you'll notice is that the images in the foreground tend to scroll at a faster rate to the images in the background. So the village, for example, scrolls at a faster rate than the mountains or even the clouds. And we've used a technique there called parallax scrolling to achieve that. What parallax scrolling is basically, having these relative speeds for different layers. So even though the images, I said there's 5 slices, we actually have different layers. So each layer is split up into 5 slices. So some of the layers we have are the snow, the village, the rail for what the monorail sits on, the mountains, and then the sky.
Okay. So when you go about implementing this, do you just have lots of different views you're putting on top of each other, or how did you implement that?
No, actually, for something with so many sort of bits and pieces and so many graphics, you definitely don't want to use views, because views are kind of heavy, both in terms of memory and in terms of runtime performance. They're not designed for something like this. They're designed for touch elements. So what we've done here is actually used one big view, which I called the village view, and I load up a bunch of images at the start, and then we override the on-draw method of the view, and then just position the different layers and the images one on top of each other and fire them off. Now the trick is, on-draw is going to be called up to 60 times a second, right? Because the device runs at 60 frames per second. So the trick is, you need to make sure that you do your execution within 16 milliseconds, because that's all the time you have. So basically what that means is, don't do any memory allocations or deallocations, because they will cause a stutter in your drawing. You'll blow your 16 millisecond time limit that you effectively have, and have a lower performance, lower frame rate. And so you don't want to do that. And you want to do all your calculations up front.
Yeah, performance is a really interesting point, because this looks very impressive here. So how well does it work on a smaller, lower end, low res device? Any tricks you had to use, and any pointers?
Yeah, look, we definitely targeted older devices. We targeted Android 2.2 or Froyo and up, and that's what, 3 years old now. So it's we're talking really lower end, low res screens. and actually they don't have a lot of memory on them either. So it's slower CPU, less RAM, and lower resolution. So we had assets that we targeted for each of those different types of devices, and we didn't target them to a specific platform version or anything. We actually used the resource qualifiers that we have in the resource hierarchy on Android. So we basically targeted it at several things. We looked at things like the DPI, low DPI, M DPI, H, and X DPI, XH DPI. That obviously got us phone categorizations. But then you'll say, well, what about tablets? Because you'll get some tablets. I mean, typically tablets can perform a lot better than phones because they've got better hardware in them, typically anyway. So you'll find something like the Nexus 7, which is a TV DPI device, 213 dp. But you want it to have the high-res images. You don't want the low-res images. So what we did is we actually used the resource qualifier there as well. So we used SW600dp to identify, hey, this is a tablet and we should target these resolutions. These high-res images, and for phones we just use the L, M, H, and X DPI, XH DPI. The last thing I want to say is we didn't do any specialization in code itself. We completely used the resource hierarchy, and that's really the right way to do it because that's what it's designed for.
Well, yeah, thanks. This looks really impressive.
Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun, great learning exercise, and really you should dive in as developers if you're exploring graphics. The Canvas API actually gets you a long way before you have to dive into OpenGL, but that's a separate discussion. So as we talked about the village, we said that the map was really the focus of our efforts for the Android app. And up until this point, we had a fairly vanilla experience. I mean, you could follow Santa and the camera tracked him. But it was at this point where we really got our creativity going and really, got excited about what we could do with this. And that was using, really playing by playing with the camera. So why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. So we started adding some more animations to the camera because we can change the zoom level, we can change the tilt, we can, change the bearing and all sorts of stuff. And we just started playing with that a bit, and I think we went a bit crazy. So rather than, the idea was to have Santa always on the screen, but we want to make it really exciting. So we thought about sports news coverage, for example. You zoom in, you can see the whole thing, you can see what's happening on the screen. That's what we were going for here as well. So, as we're following Santa around, we're zooming in, we have close-up of him going past places, and then as Santa's getting closer to a location, his destination, we're actually zooming in a bit more, and you can see exactly where he is heading, you can see exactly where he's going to be next.
Yeah, and as you can see from the demo here, we're zooming in, zooming out, rotating. At the end of the day, I guess what we ended up building was a somewhat cinematic but passive experience for Santa, and Santa Cam really came into its own here.
Exactly.
But I also noticed that as these demos are going and the rotations happening, you can see Santa, his marker is also rotating. So obviously he wasn't a 3D object. So how did you go with this?
Yeah, so markers are always facing one direction. So there's a trick we had to use. So we actually have different images and just swapping them in depending on which direction Santa's traveling in. But then the question was, how do we know where Santa's traveling? Because you can rotate the camera. So we have to calculate where the direction which he's traveling from, where he's leaving from his departure to his arrival location. And we also have to take into account the camera, so the direction which the camera is facing at the moment.
Yeah, so we were basically listening in from a map view point of view for these camera update events.
Yeah.
And using the on-camera change listener to tell us that, hey, the camera's rotated in a certain way, we now need to update the marker.
Yeah, that's right. The only trick here was that you only get these updates once the camera update has finished. So you don't get them as the camera is animating. So we're taking an educated guess to see, okay, the camera is probably going to animate in this way, so let's swap out the icons in this direction and hope that that's going to match up.
Sounds like you're challenging these developers, these users to break it. But the other thing is I noticed that you can tap on a location and bring up info windows. Is that all? Does that all fit well with all this?
So there was a bit of a challenge here because so you can see we have the dashboard at the bottom giving you some stats on what Santa has been up to. And if you tap on a marker, by default it always centers it on the screen. But if you have the dashboard open, like on a tablet, on the full expanded version of the dashboard, it would overlap the marker. So we actually had to add a few extra tricks to make sure that the marker doesn't actually overlap the dashboard.
And so we just basically positioned it did an offset so that the info window was visible.
Exactly. So basically calculate how much space we have on the screen for the visible map, and basically just put the marker and then the info window.
Yeah, so that was the info windows. We actually were tried to make the dashboard itself fairly intelligent as well. So you'll notice that this map implements responsive design. So what that means is basically on a phone or on a tablet, it actually positions the dashboard at different locations, and even its initial state, whether it's expanded or summarized, varies depending on what screens you're using. So for example, on the phone it always starts off in the collapsed or summary mode, as we called it, whereas on the tablet it always starts off expanded, but in portrait mode it'll be in the center of the screen, whereas in landscape mode it'll be at the bottom right of the screen, because we just thought it fit well in terms of a layout there. So we did make some interesting decisions there, though, about the collapsed mode, right? Yeah, so
we didn't want to lose any information. So we basically added, we're basically scrolling in the extra information from the bottom of the dashboard. So you're not going to miss out on anything. And we also added a marquee effect to it. So if there's text coming in that's too long, it doesn't fit into the one line. This is basically scrolling it through.
Yeah, and that's particularly important when we localize. Remember that. So because some of this text can be a lot longer.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, that's the dashboard. So at this point in the development lifecycle, we were looking pretty good. The app was coming together. It was looking fairly complete.
But I think there was still something missing.
Sound effects!
And presence.
Yes, of course.
Presence.
So with sound effects, we started adding, up until this point, the app was a silent app, which it was still fun, but as soon as we started adding sound effects, we added some birds in the village, some jingles for the sleigh, and even Santa himself would chuck in a ho 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 every so often, and it just really livened up the experience.
Yeah, it really did. And the presents were quite good too. I mean, that's why Santa's traveling around the world, right? So our Santa's also giving out presents.
So how did you implement the presents then?
So each of these presents, as you can see here, they're moving over the map. They're actually markers.
Oh, right.
So we're basically animating markers again. But as you can see, the presents are dropping onto the ground. So we actually have different markers that we're swapping in. So we have icons we're using. They're a bit more transparent, with the presents a bit smaller. We're basically swapping those, and it looks like the present is falling onto the ground.
Well, into people's houses and not onto people, right?
Yeah, that's right. Let's hope so.
Yeah, so I mean, now we have an animated Santa delivering presents, traveling around the world. You know, at this point, we had a real sense of satisfaction that this app was, you know, a ton of fun, and that we hope that families all around the world would enjoy it. So I guess this really concludes today's Google Developer Live. We hope that those of you that use the app enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed building it. And I guess we'll see you next time.
Yeah, see you.
Bye-bye.